Dr. Alexander Reed was a man of quiet routines. A respected astronomer, his days were spent peering into the vast expanse of the universe, alone in his remote observatory nestled high in the mountains. His life was one of solitude, punctuated only by the occasional radio transmission from a colleague or a rare trip into the nearest town. He had chosen this life deliberately, finding comfort in the predictable nature of the stars, far removed from the complexities of human relationships. Alexander was scientifically curious, always searching for answers among the celestial bodies, yet his heart remained distant, a fortress built by years of isolation. But tonight, something broke the monotony. As he sat at his telescope, scanning the heavens, a sudden flash of light streaked across the night sky. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, brighter, more intense, and moving with a purpose that defied the random nature of shooting stars. His pulse quickened, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Was it a comet? A meteor? He scrambled to adjust his instruments, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. This was what he had been waiting for, a discovery that could redefine his understanding of the universe. The object's trajectory was clear, it was heading toward Earth, and fast. Alexander's calculations indicated that it would crash nearby, deep in the forest that surrounded his observatory. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat, a flashlight, and his old camera, and rushed out into the cold night. The forest was dense, the path treacherous, but his determination drove him forward. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the only sounds his own hurried footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. As he approached the site, a faint, eerie glow began to filter through the trees. His breath caught in his throat. He pushed through the underbrush, and there, in a small clearing, he saw it, a massive, metallic object half buried in the soil, still radiating an otherworldly light. It was no ordinary meteorite. The surface was smooth, almost reflective, with strange symbols etched into the metal. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. Alexander stood frozen, a mixture of awe and terror coursing through him. This was a discovery far beyond anything he had imagined. Cautiously he moved closer, unable to resist the pull of his curiosity. He reached out, fingers trembling, to touch the cold surface. As he did, the ground beneath him trembled slightly, and a crack appeared in the metallic shell. He stepped back, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The crack widened, spreading like a spider's web across the surface, accompanied by a soft, almost musical hum. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the shell split open, and from within, something emerged. Alexander shielded his eyes from the brilliance, his heart racing. When the light faded, he lowered his hand, and what he saw took his breath away. Standing before him was a figure, tall, slender, and undeniably alien. Her skin shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, iridescent and beautiful, casting a soft glow that illuminated the clearing. Her eyes, large and filled with an ancient wisdom, met his with an intensity that pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Alexander could only stare speechless, as the alien girl stepped out of the remnants of the egg-like structure. She was stunning, otherworldly in a way that defied human comprehension. Her features were delicate, yet there was a strength in her gaze that spoke of a long journey, of survival against unimaginable odds. Alexander's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He had spent his life studying the stars, searching for signs of life beyond Earth, but he had never imagined it would come to him like this. Here, in this isolated forest, under the cover of night, his life had intersected with something extraordinary, something that would change him forever. The girl took a step toward him, and Alexander, despite the shock and disbelief, found himself stepping forward as well. He felt a connection, an unspoken understanding that transcended language and species. This was no ordinary encounter. It was the beginning of something far greater, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the universe, and about himself. As they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the broken shell, Alexander knew one thing for certain: his life, his world, would never be the same again. Lyra was unlike anything Alexander had ever imagined. She was a living embodiment of the cosmos, her skin shimmering with an iridescent glow that seemed to shift and change with the light, as if the very stars themselves were reflected in her being. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, cascading down her back in waves that moved as if touched by an unseen breeze. Her eyes, large and expressive, held a depth that spoke of untold wisdom and countless lifetimes lived. Yet, within them, there was a flicker of vulnerability, a silent plea for understanding. Her presence was overwhelming, a blend of beauty and alien power that left Alexander in awe. But beneath the surface, there was something more, a profound sadness, a weariness that came from a life of endless running. As the moments passed, Alexander felt the initial shock give way to a deep sense of compassion. This was no conqueror, no invader from the stars. Lyra was a refugee, a soul adrift in a universe that had shown her little kindness. Her origins were as ancient as the galaxies themselves. Lyra belonged to a race known as the etherians, beings of pure energy who had once thrived in harmony with the elements of their homeworld. Their abilities were extraordinary, a gift from the universe that allowed them to control the very forces of nature. They could summon storms, calm the seas, and bring life to barren lands. But with such power came the burden of responsibility, and the etherians had lived in peace, using their abilities to nurture and protect. That peace, however, had been shattered by the rise of a tyrannical empire, a brutal force that sought to dominate the cosmos. The empire's leaders, ruthless in their ambition, had discovered the etherians and their unique abilities. They saw in Lyra's people a means to expand their power, to weaponize the very elements of nature for their own gain. The etherians had resisted, but the empire was relentless, its technological might overwhelming even the most powerful of their kind. One by one, the etherians had fallen, their world reduced to ashes. Those who survived were hunted, their powers exploited, their lives turned into tools of destruction. Lyra had been one of the few to escape, her flight across the stars a desperate bid for freedom. She had been on the run for what felt like an eternity, her journey leading her to the far reaches of the universe, to the blue planet called Earth. But even here, she was not safe. The Empire's reach was long, and their agents, the bounty hunters, were always close behind. They wanted her not just for her powers, but for something even more valuable, her ability to manipulate time, a gift that could turn the tide of any battle. As she shared her story, her words faltering as she struggled to bridge the gap between their languages, Alexander felt a powerful connection forming between them. His heart, long accustomed to solitude, began to stir with emotions he had kept buried for years. He saw in Lyra a kindred spirit, someone who had known loss and loneliness, who had been forced to survive in a world that offered little mercy. But he also saw in her a spark of hope, a will to fight against the darkness that sought to consume her. Their communication was slow at first, filled with halting words and hesitant gestures. But gradually, they began to understand one another, finding a common language in their shared experiences. Alexander's curiosity, once purely scientific, was now driven by something far more personal. He wanted to know everything about her, where she came from, what she had seen, and most importantly, how he could help her. The more he learned, the more he realized the danger she was in, and the more determined he became to protect her. Lyra's plight weighed heavily on him. The thought of her being captured, of her powers being used to fuel the Empire's wars, was unbearable. He couldn't stand by and let that happen. He knew the risks, knew that by helping her, he was putting himself in the crosshairs of a force far beyond his understanding. But he also knew that he couldn't turn his back on her. Not now. Not when she had come to him, trusting him, in her moment of greatest need. He made his decision with the quiet resolve that had guided him throughout his life. Lyra would stay with him, hidden in the sanctuary of his observatory. It was remote enough to avoid detection, at least for a time, and he had the resources to keep her safe, to shield her from the eyes of those who would harm her. But more than that, he had the will to protect her, to stand against whatever forces came their way. As they prepared for the days ahead, the bond between them grew stronger. There was a comfort in each other's presence, a sense of shared purpose that made the looming threat seem less daunting. Alexander, who had spent so many years isolated from the world, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't thought possible. And Lyra, who had known nothing but fear and loss for so long, began to trust him, to rely on his strength and compassion. Together they were more than just an astronomer and an alien. They were two souls bound by fate, united in a struggle against a common enemy. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they faced it with a determination born of necessity, and something more, something deeper that neither of them could yet fully understand. The peace that had briefly settled over Alexander's observatory was shattered by the arrival of the bounty hunters. These were no ordinary hunters. They were the Empire's finest, equipped with technology that far surpassed anything Earth had to offer. Their ships, sleek and silent, cut through the atmosphere like knives, leaving no trace of their passage. They were relentless, their senses finely tuned to detect even the faintest hint of Lyra's presence. Their mission was clear: capture the Etherian girl and bring her back to the Empire, dead or alive. Failure was not an option. The first sign of their presence came as a distant hum, a vibration that resonated through the ground and sent a chill down Alexander's spine. He knew instantly what it meant. Lyra's pursuers had found her. There was no time to lose. He and Lyra had to move, and fast. The forest that had once been his refuge now became their battleground, the dense trees and rugged terrain both a shield and a trap. The chase was on, and it was a race against time. The bounty hunters were closing in, their sensors sweeping the area with cold precision. Alexander led the way, his knowledge of the land guiding them through hidden paths and narrow ravines. He moved with a determination fueled by fear and desperation, knowing that every second counted. Lyra followed, her abilities adding an edge to their flight. With a mere thought, she could manipulate the elements around them, creating distractions and barriers that slowed their pursuers. A sudden gust of wind would knock a hunter off balance, a burst of fog would obscure their vision, and roots would rise from the ground to trip them up. But the hunters were not so easily deterred. For every obstacle Lyra created, they had a countermeasure, their advanced technology adapting to her tactics with terrifying speed. Despite the danger, there were moments of quiet connection between Alexander and Lyra, moments where the frantic pace slowed just enough for them to catch their breath and look at each other, truly seeing the other for the first time. In those brief respites, they communicated without words, the trust between them growing stronger with each passing minute. Alexander marveled at her courage, her determination to survive despite the odds stacked against her. And Lyra, in turn, found solace in his unwavering resolve to protect her, no matter the cost. But the tension was never far away. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the corner of their vision, was a reminder that the hunters were always close behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the scent of danger. Alexander could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. If they were caught, it wouldn't just be Lyra who would suffer. The Empire would learn of Earth's existence, and they would stop at nothing to exploit it just as they had exploited Lyra's people. Their escape took them deeper into the wilderness, far from the safety of the observatory. Alexander's knowledge of the terrain was their greatest advantage, but even he could only do so much. The hunters were gaining ground, their relentless pursuit wearing them down. It was during one of these desperate moments, when the hunters were almost upon them, that disaster struck. In their haste to evade capture, Alexander missed a step, his foot catching on a hidden root. He fell hard, a sharp pain shooting through his leg. Lyra turned back, her eyes wide with fear, but it was too late. The hunters had found them. Alexander could see the cold gleam of their weapons, the calculated movements as they closed in for the kill. He tried to rise, but the pain was too much. This was the end. But then, something extraordinary happened. In that moment of absolute terror, Lyra's instincts took over. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Alexander's shoulder, and the world around them seemed to shift. Time itself warped, the sounds of the hunters fading into silence as the scene before them began to rewind. The pain in Alexander's leg disappeared, the ground under him steady once more. He was back on his feet, standing exactly where he had been moments before the fall. It took him a moment to realize what had happened. Lyra had turned back time, undoing his injury and giving them a second chance. But in doing so, she had also revealed her most dangerous power, a power the Empire would stop at nothing to possess. The hunters, though disoriented by the sudden shift, quickly regrouped. They were more determined than ever, now fully aware of the prize they were chasing. With renewed urgency, Alexander and Lyra resumed their flight, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Lyra's time manipulation had saved his life, but at a great cost. The hunters now knew exactly where they were, and the Empire was surely on its way. The threat loomed larger than ever, a dark shadow that promised no. As the night wore on, the bond between Alexander and Lyra deepened, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. They were no longer just two individuals fighting for survival. They were partners, united by a common cause and a shared fate. But with the Empire closing in, their options were running out. The chase was far from over, and the hardest decisions were yet to come. As the hours passed in the shadow of their relentless pursuers, Alexander and Lyra sought refuge in a secluded cave deep within the forest. The brief respite allowed them to catch their breath and, more importantly, confront the reality of their situation. It was here, in the dim light of their hiding place, that the true nature of Lyra's arrival on Earth began to unravel. For the first time since their harrowing escape began, they had a moment to reflect. Alexander's mind, always sharp and inquisitive, churned through the details of everything that had happened since Lyra's arrival. The meteorite, the advanced technology of the hunters, Lyra's elemental powers, it all pointed to something much larger, something that transcended the mere chance of her landing on Earth. There was a purpose, a reason she had come here, and Alexander was determined to understand it. Through fragmented conversation and shared insights, a startling truth emerged. The meteorite that had brought Lyra to Earth was not a random cosmic event, but a carefully planned mission by her people, the etherians. They had sent her to Earth deliberately, knowing that this planet held something unique, something that could potentially save their dying race. It wasn't just about hiding Lyra from the Empire. It was about unlocking a power that had long been dormant, a power that only humanity could awaken. The revelation was as profound as it was shocking. Humanity, with all its flaws and imperfections, possessed a hidden potential that the etherians had recognized. It was something beyond mere technology or physical strength. It was an innate quality, an unyielding spirit that could rise to extraordinary heights in times of need. The etherians had seen this potential in the history of Earth's people, in their capacity for resilience, creativity, and compassion. They believed that humans could unlock the full extent of Lyra's abilities, transforming her into a force capable of challenging the Empire and protecting what remained of her people. This understanding transformed Alexander's role in the unfolding events. No longer was he just a protector or a guide, he was now a key figure in a struggle that spanned galaxies. His actions, his decisions, would have consequences far beyond his isolated life in the observatory. The weight of this realization settled heavily on his shoulders, but it also ignited a fire within him. The bond he had formed with Lyra was now infused with a deeper purpose, a mission to unlock the potential that lay within both her and humanity. The gravity of their situation became all the more real as they prepared for what was to come. The Empire was closing in, their forces undoubtedly on their way. Alexander and Lyra knew that their time was running out. The final confrontation was inevitable, and they had to be ready. Every moment they spent together was a blend of urgent preparation and silent reflection, a mix of fear and determination that drove them to push forward despite the overwhelming odds. In these moments, the emotional stakes reached their peak. Alexander, once a man content with solitude, now found himself driven by a fierce need to protect not just Lyra, but the very idea of what they could achieve together. He could see the toll this journey had taken on her, the weariness in her eyes, the fear that lingered just beneath the surface. Yet, there was also a steely resolve, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. Lyra, for her part, had come to rely on Alexander in ways she hadn't expected. His strength, his unwavering support, had given her hope in the darkest of times. As they made their final preparations, the tension was palpable. They both knew what was at stake. The fate of Lyra's people, and perhaps the future of humanity itself, rested on their ability to stand against the Empire's forces. It was a daunting realization, but it also gave them a sense of purpose that transcended fear. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a future where the etherians could live free, where humanity could rise to its full potential, and where the Empire's tyranny could be challenged. The moment of reckoning came faster than they expected. The air grew thick with the sound of approaching ships, the faint hum of advanced technology reverberating through the earth beneath their feet. There was no time left to second guess, no time for doubt. Alexander and Lyra stood together, side by side, as the first of the Empire's forces broke through the forest canopy, their dark shapes looming ominously against the sky. Everything they had been through led to this point. The choices they had made, the bond they had forged, all came down to this final stand. The odds were against them, the enemy overwhelming in both numbers and power, but neither Alexander nor Lyra wavered. They were ready to face whatever came next, knowing that their fight was more than just a battle for survival. It was a fight for the very soul of two worlds. As the Empire's forces descended upon them, there was a sense of calm amidst the storm. Alexander, once a man of quiet solitude, now found himself a pivotal figure in an intergalactic struggle. And Lyra, the girl who had fallen from the stars, stood beside him, her powers ready to be unleashed in ways that even she could not fully comprehend. Together, they faced the approaching darkness, their hearts united by a shared purpose, ready to defy the odds and stand for something greater than themselves. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as the Empire's forces descended upon them, the ground shaking with the approach of their relentless machinery. Alexander and Lyra stood together, their resolve hardening in the face of overwhelming odds. This was the moment they had both dreaded and prepared for, the final showdown that would determine the fate of Lyra's people and perhaps the future of humanity itself. The battle began with a fury that took Alexander's breath away. The Empire's soldiers, clad in dark, impenetrable armor, advanced with terrifying precision, their weapons blazing with energy that crackled through the air. But they were met with a force they hadn't anticipated. Lyra's powers, now fully unlocked with Alexander's help, surged to life in a display of elemental fury. With a wave of her hand, she summoned a wall of fire that roared across the battlefield, forcing the soldiers to halt in their tracks. The flames danced with a life of their own, bending to Lyra's will, forming barriers and weapons that struck out at the enemy with unrelenting force. But the Empire's forces were not easily deterred. Their technology adapted quickly, countering Lyra's attacks with energy shields and advanced weaponry that sliced through the elemental defenses. The battle raged on, a clash of raw power and cold, calculated strategy. Alexander fought alongside Lyra, using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their enemies, setting traps and leading the soldiers into ambushes that bought them precious time. But as the battle wore on, it became clear that the Empire's numbers were too great, their technology too advanced. It was then that the moment of sacrifice arrived, a decision that Alexander had feared but knew was inevitable. The battle had pushed them to the brink, and they were running out of options. The Empire's forces were closing in, their weapons trained on Lyra, intent on capturing her at any cost. Alexander realized that the only way to protect her, to ensure the survival of her race, was to tap into the hidden potential that had brought her to Earth in the first place, the untapped power within humanity. With a calmness that belied the chaos around him, Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between Lyra and the advancing soldiers. He could feel the energy coursing through the air, the latent power that had been hinted at in their revelations. It was a power born not of technology or elemental forces, but of something deeper, humanity's capacity for selflessness, for sacrifice, for love. It was a power that could change the course of history, if only he had the courage to embrace it. In that moment, Alexander made his choice. He reached out, not with his hands, but with his heart, tapping into the connection he had formed with Lyra, the bond that had grown stronger with every challenge they had faced. He channeled that connection, that love, into a single, desperate act of sacrifice. The energy that had lain dormant within him surged to life, a blinding light that exploded outward, enveloping the battlefield in a radiant glow. The soldiers, caught off guard by the sudden burst of power, faltered, their weapons falling silent. The energy coursed through Alexander, a force that defied explanation, a manifestation of the very essence of humanity. It was as if the hopes, dreams, and struggles of every person who had ever lived were concentrated into a single moment, a single act of defiance against the darkness that sought to consume them. As the light faded, the battlefield fell silent. The Empire's forces, overwhelmed by the sheer power of Alexander's sacrifice, retreated, their ranks broken, their resolve shattered. Lyra, tears streaming down her face, rushed to Alexander's side. He had given everything to protect her, to protect the future they had fought so hard to secure. The cost had been great, but in that moment, they knew they had won. The aftermath of the battle was a time of reflection, of healing. The Empire had been defeated, but the victory had come at a price. Alexander, weakened by the sacrifice he had made, leaned on Lyra for support, their bond stronger than ever. They had both changed in ways they couldn't fully understand, their lives forever intertwined by the events they had survived. The connection between them was no longer just a bond of survival. It was a partnership, a promise to face whatever came next together. As they looked out over the battlefield, the smoke clearing to reveal the devastation that had been wrought, they knew that their fight was far from over. The Empire would not be easily defeated, and a larger struggle for freedom and justice still loomed on the horizon. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the power of humanity's potential, a force that had only just begun to be realized. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers that neither of them could predict. But it was also filled with hope, with the promise of a new beginning for both Lyra's people and humanity. Together they would continue their fight, not just for survival, but for a future where all beings could live free from tyranny and fear. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the shattered landscape, Alexander and Lyra stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly together. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and now they looked toward the dawn of a new day, a new era. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to face it, together, united by a bond that would carry them through whatever came next.